Hello, and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. When you're ready to build your next pipeline and want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode today, that's Linode, and get a $100 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. So now your modern data stack is set up. How is everyone going to find the data they need and understand it? Select Star is a data discovery platform that automatically analyzes and documents your data. For every table in Select Star, you can find out where the data originated, which dashboards are built on top of it, who's using it in the company and how they're using it, all the way down to the SQL queries. Best of all, it's simple to set up and easy for both engineering and operations teams to use. With Select Star's data catalog, a single source of truth for your data is built in minutes, even across thousands of datasets. Try it out for free and double the length of your free trial at dataengineeringpodcast.com/selectstar. You'll also get a swag package when you continue on a paid plan. Your host is Tobias Macey, and today I'm interviewing Tarush Aggarwal about how he and his team are helping organizations streamline adoption of the modern data stack. So, Tarush, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hey, Tobias. Firstly, thank you so much for having me on the show again. Really looking forward to being here and hopefully adding some value to your audience. Happy to sort of introduce myself. I've spent my career in data. I sort of started being one of the early engineers on the analytics team at Salesforce. Most recently worked at WeWork, got to help scale the data team, a sort of data organization. We supported 10 to 1,000 employees and basically found myself in Bali at the beginning of COVID and a sort of company called 5X.
And so you mentioned that you got your start working with Salesforce and that you helped to scale the data team at WeWork. I'm wondering if you can just share what it is about the overall ecosystem of data and that problem space that keeps you interested and keeps you working in it.
When I got started, I sort of started as a software engineer, and very quickly I realized that it wasn't for me. The whole idea of working on a particular feature, for an extended period of time wasn't that interested. I was a lot more interested in, how do you enable the business to actually hit what the business wants to achieve? And, I really found that with data, you get to sort of get a bird's eye view of what's happening in the business, but also be able to zoom down and really sort of focus on, what's needed in order to sort of drive change. And, when we sort of got started 10 years ago at salesforce.com, the infrastructure needed just wasn't there. We were doing a lot of this stuff ourselves. And one of the things which the modern data stack movement has really enabled is, companies of all sizes to be able to ultimately bring some of the value which sort of companies like WeWork and Salesforce sort of can do at scale, and sort of very focused on solving that problem of how do we make it easy for 95% of businesses that are not WeWork and Salesforce, which can deploy an army of engineers? How do we solve the sort of problem of helping them focus on business outcome through sort of data and analytics?
And so that brings us to the work that you're doing now with 5X and helping organizations adopt the modern data stack. So I'm wondering if you can share a bit more about some of the origin story and what it is that you are building at 5X and some of the ways that your focus and operating model have shifted since the last time we spoke about a year ago.
Yeah, gosh, I know we were just talking about it. It's been a year and everything seems sort of super different. So, just sort of setting some sort of background, right? Like the amount of data companies is sort of collecting is increasing and increasing. We sort of read somewhere that the average sort of startup today has got between 10 to 12 sources of data. And, while data is increasing, it's becoming increasingly harder to extract business value from data. And if you think about it, the modern data stack is this huge movement, and we have, all these amazing vendors like we have Snowflake and dbt and Fivetran and Looker, but also that the stack is extremely fragmented. You have, a different best-in-class vendor for every layer of the stack. And, this kind of starts from data collection, ingestion, storage, modeling, reporting. You have data lineage, you have decision-making, you have reverse ETL, machine learning experimentation. I just name like 10 layers of the stack. And if each of them have their own vendor, it's, very, very difficult for a company which is not WeWork or Salesforce to be able to go sign all these enterprise contracts and sort of stitch it together. So, what we're really up to is how do we work with all these best in class vendors and sort of pre-stitch them, figure out the entire enterprise contract piece and allow anyone to, go on to 5x, enter their credit card, and sort of 5 minutes later, they have the modern data stack all configured, all ready to go, so that they can kind of focus on the business outcomes instead of having to worry about how do you set it up, or instead of worrying about sort of signing these contracts. And I think, when we were speaking a year ago, where we were was this best practice on what this data stack is and how to set it up. And at that point, we were really going into companies and sort of teaching them how to set it up in such a way which is going to really streamline operations and make it really easier for them to sort of scale and grow. Sort of what we realized after speaking to a bunch of customers is that every company as they scale encounters this problem where they need this stack, they need to sort of set it up and get value from it. So we were onto the right track over there. It turns out that 99% of these companies want you to do it for them instead of learn how to do it. So what really changed is, instead of teaching them how to do it, we sort of decided to go build this platform so that everyone can get this core stack out of the box. And then we also started a sort of marketplace where we can actually train, where we can actually hire, amazing data engineers and train them on the best practices on the data stack, on, how to get set up, and then allow companies to, embed these engineers sort of directly into their business. So, removing training companies to, basically providing the data platform as a service, and then training the engineers so that there's a lot more standardization at the engineer level, and then allowing companies to use the platform and embed these engineers so that they can ultimately drive these business outcomes.
As far as the modern data stack, you listed a few different vendors, and I know that there's been a lot of debate and conversation about what the term means, and there are some very philosophical views about it. I'm wondering if you can share your perspective on what you actually mean when you say the term modern data stack.
I think, again, 10 years ago, none of this really existed. A lot of this in some point sort of got started with, with the sort of big data revolution and kind of, the Hortonworks and sort of cloud eras. And, Hadoop and Spark and all of these kind of tools came out of it. And I think what's kind of become increasingly clear in the last few years is there's been like multiple sort of technologies which have really, started to become mainstream, and the data warehouse was sort of one of them. And, with the data warehouse, came this sort of ecosystem of tools around the warehouse, like, ingestion providers like Fivetran, and then modeling on top of the warehouse. The advent of basically sort of SQL at scale sort of began this, what I refer to as the sort of modern data stack movement. And what's become more clear is that, technologies like Spark and sort of Hadoop have kind of become more of like niche use cases where, they're still sort of relevant, they're still extremely good at certain use cases, but for, the majority of companies, for the majority of use cases, using something like the data warehouse has become more sort of mainstream. And, kind of what I refer to as, the sort of modern data stack, it's, the sort of tools and technologies around the sort of data warehouse and sort of that ecosystem, if that makes sense. Not to say that, things like Kafka or, things like sort of Spark and Hadoop are sort of not relevant. They're extremely relevant, and, they start kind of playing well into this ecosystem at some level. But, this is like a core kind of ecosystem around the warehouse. And I think that's really, what we sort of refer to as the modern data stack.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the common thread that I've seen in most of the conversations I've had about the modern data stack, is that it is reorienting around the data warehouse as the focal point of everything having to do with data.
I sort of totally agree. And, I think sort of Snowflake's IPO in some ways, made that fairly clear, right? The sort of largest IPO in tech history happened to be a sort of data company. I think that's sort of setting the path for the next 5 years. And if you, just look at someone like Matt Turk's sort of State of Data 2021, he's got this sort of massive diagram of, what are all the different categories inside the data space. And if you start looking at how many of them kind of are most recently, on top of the warehouse or on top of technologies powered by the warehouse, it's kind of becoming clear that, that's the direction we're sort of heading in.
In the time from when you first started working on 5x data and had this model of being an enabler and helping organizations build their own internal capacity for being able to manage advanced analytics, to where you are now of helping to sort of re-aggregate the modern data stack and provide services and capabilities on top of that, what are some of the biggest shifts that you've seen in the market for data management and some of the ways that organizations are approaching it?
I think the storyline is getting more and more clear, right? Like where companies begin, they might go try to assemble these pieces themselves. They might start off with a BI tool and a warehouse. Increasingly, as they sort of mature, right, bringing in the right ingestion layers, bringing in the right sort of modeling layers. So, we're starting to see that playbook sort of happen over and over again. And, the evolution of that playbook is, at some point, you require an additional set of tools, right? Whether it's starting to collect a lot of data sets, you sort of really care about data lineage or sort of data catalog, or you want to start pushing this in a sort of intelligence into sort of back into some of your application systems or your marketing tools with things like reverse ETL. So, what we've seen is that the core stack is starting to be more and more, sort of well understood and sort of finalized. And we're starting to see the use cases around the edges. But also, in terms of from a security perspective, from compliance, from GDPR, from PII, what we're seeing is that a lot of companies are adopting this stack and then having to kind of figure out these pieces on top of it. So, it's just a matter of maturity before companies need to start figuring out how they're going to deal with PII information, whether it's going to be encrypted, how do they deal with the GDPR process and making sure that, the data ecosystem is compliant, for the companies inside regulated spaces, things like governance and things like audit are sort of relevant, right? And, to some extent, because a lot of these companies set up these tools in their own way, they are really building a lot of these sort of security guards and rails and access control and governance also in their own way. There are a few platforms which do it, but for the most part, they don't integrate into the sort of modern data stack sort of space, right? So, one of the things we've seen are like the vendors are sort of fairly standardized, but again, because there's no standardization in how these vendors play together, how they're set up, how do you do end-to-end security and sort of user permissions, that companies have to go figure out this sort of security layer on top. And I think for us, there's this huge advantage where we can give, sort of companies the sort of flexibility of, adding different vendors in the space, but we can offer, sort of holistic products around, these sort of areas, which are sort of more standardized, which an early stage company doesn't need to care about, but as a company starts to mature, they can sort of just turn these products on.
For the organizations that you're working with in your current formulation of the problem that you're solving, what are some of the general trends that you see in terms of the size or scale of the organization and the particular challenges that they're facing that they're looking for assistance with being able to adopt these new capabilities offered by the modern data stack?
The few sort of trends which stick out, and I think number one is, when companies start to invest in data, some of the early stage companies using, at the moment, we're sort of fairly broad. Our smallest companies are pre-product and our sort of largest companies, public tech companies. So, at the very early stage, we're seeing more and more companies start to, really invest in this even pre-product. Just knowing that, when they do want to launch, they want to have the right models in place, they want to have the right metrics, they want to make sure that they have collected the rights, that they have been sort of collecting the right data in place. So, we're starting to see companies do this way earlier than sort of what we typically saw, which was, a much later stage company. The whole idea of being data driven was an expensive proposition. You had all of these different tools which you would sign enterprise contracts. So, arguably, spend 100K before you even, build anything. And then, hiring data engineers and data platform engineers and analysts, was in general a pretty expensive proposition. It sort of used to cost companies $500,000 just to get started. with a lot more self-service and, with sort of what we do, the sort of price to do this has become exponentially cheaper. So we're seeing companies do this a lot earlier on. The other trend which we're seeing is that, the hybrid model of working with, offshore engineers is just going to kind of become a lot more popular, right? Like we're seeing companies who have 10, 15 open heads, especially, minus the 5 or 10% of pure tech Silicon Valley companies, which will, pay extremely high salaries and kind of have offices and, all the tech havens. If you remove that, 10% and you focus on the remaining 90% of companies, which don't have the luxury of doing that, I think in general, we're living in an engineering drought for the next 15 years. They're not going to be enough engineers. And when you narrow that down into data, that sort of gets amplified, right? So, we're starting to see more and more of that hybrid playbook of how can we focus on, areas which are going to impact the business more and more, like data science and sort of data analytics. And how can we offload a lot of the data platform and the core data engineering, ingesting, modeling, structuring, sort of basic BI to teams which are just a lot more efficient in doing that. These are two of the trends which we've seen in sort of being around in this new model for about 8-9 months now.
As far as the underlying technologies that you're focusing on for customers that come to you, what are the primary building blocks that you are using to help empower these customers to build out their analytical capabilities? And what are some of the pieces that they're typically coming to you with already in place, and just some of the ways that those two map together, where you have these set of technologies that you will default to in a greenfield environment, and the types of technologies that organizations are coming to you with, and just how you're able to mesh them together?
You know, in some ways, a lot of organizations might have, some pieces of it. I think the five core layers, and not all of these are sort of relevant for every company, but starting off with data collection, where you have your, mixed panel amplitudes or heaps, and then ingestion, where, something like Stitch or Fivetran, and sort of storage with obviously Snowflake, BigQuery, maybe Redshift, modeling with DBT, and sort of BI with, the whole range of tools. If you kind of look at these five as really the core stack, and then, maybe data lineage, reverse ETL, sort of decision making, machine learning as, the fringe are kind of on top of it. A few of the folks we work with kind of might have, BI tool and a sort of storage layer. What the stack which we really push for is, using Fivetran, Snowflake, DBT is really our sort of core stack. If someone is using, an Oracle database or sort of Amazon Redshift, we don't really have any problems with that. But you won't be able to kind of plug into our ecosystem because we've built a lot on top of, Snowflake. At some point, we'll probably add BigQuery over there. But really, Fivetran, Snowflake, DBT sort of out of the box is really, our core stack. Increasingly, more and more customers are, on Snowflake or, sort of using a big, it doesn't matter what data collection or BI tool you use, they kind of play into this. So, what we've seen is that for a lot of companies, we're filling in the blanks if a few pieces are missing. If they're on a completely different stacks, we've sort of got really good at sort of migrations of kind of how you move to this core stack. And now increasingly, being able to, integrate with, tools like reverse ETL or sort of decision making with something like narrator.ai is kind of also, more and more companies are just doing this much sooner. So, I think that stack is in general becoming broader and broader.
As far as that integration process of being able to tie together these different technologies, what are some of the sharp edges that you have run into, and some of the ways that you've approached sort of smoothing that for your end users to give them a more pleasant and holistic experience of these disparate technologies?
Yeah, so I think number one, increasingly companies having more and more PII and having a sort of PII strategy, right? Like we no longer want, we have a bank using us today and other financial institutions, and you don't want to share, someone's credit card details or any of that financial information, right? So, how does that kind of process work, right? And today we use sort of masked encryption at the sort of column level. So, we can pick up PII fields upfront, and when the data goes into 5x, when the data goes into Snowflake, it's sort of automatically you only have your security admins that can actually view this, right? So that's kind of one sort of sharp case which increasingly kind of is kind of becoming more and more relevant. I think the other one, which we haven't, is sort of what we're looking at right now, is really this sort of data lineage, sort of data catalog piece, right? What's happening that companies are getting more data literate is that the number of data sets inside a company is sort of blowing up exponentially. And, I think one of the massive pieces which was always missing in the data stack was this concept of sort of, having a sort of catalog and sort of lineage play, right? So, we're really, integrating this in right now. We wanted to be part of our core stack, right? So, when you get out of the box, we sort of talk about Snowflake, DBT, and sort of Fivetran, but potentially having something like a sort of Marquez in there, or at some point something like an Atlan in there is an edge case which we're seeing increasingly more, which is probably one of our biggest focuses in terms of what's coming next into our platform.
Yeah, I was going to ask next about sort of what you see as being the main white spaces and what most people regard as the modern data stack, and just some of the missing pieces that need to be more prevalent or become sort of part of the vanguard of technologies that everybody adopts out of the gate versus coming to later on in their maturity cycle.
I think the biggest one out of the box would be around metadata management, which is the broad topic, but sort of lineage or catalog. And I think reverse ETL is, we spent the last 5 years making sure that we have reporting outside of application tools. So, you have information in Salesforce and marketing tools, sort of users to use Looker or to use, sort of Tableau or sort of whatever you're using, to look at sort of dashboards there. And finally, going back to the idea of, hey, actually, you should be able to see reports back in the tools, which, we should see reports in the tools which your teams are actually using, right? So, we always saw that as a sort of white gap in the sort of stack. So I think that's sort of another area. And I think lastly, going back to this sort of security conversation, right? Like, not having what starts to bite companies very quickly as they scale is, hey, we need to, have a PII, posture, or we need to be able to do audit or compliance, sort of any of those security elements. And then just realizing that you've set up everything in a way which wasn't really built in order to, have different roles and governance and all of this, right? So, is a huge opportunity for us to be able to now provide, especially on the security side, that whole part of the business as a sort of product on top of the stack.
In terms of the work that you're doing at 5X, because you are relying on these underlying technology platforms, there's a lot that you can take off the shelf. But what are some of the pieces of engineering that you've had to do to be able to present all of this in a unified manner and be able to have a single interface for your customers to be able to access all of these various systems?
We're still working on sort of making all of this sort of self-service, right? Like, at the moment today, we sort of bundle the sort of platform as well as the engineer, because it's not fully automated. We have to kind of go do some manual stuff, right? So it has to come bundled with the engineer. A few months from now, you'll be able to go to 5X, enter your credit card, and, have the stack running in, a few clicks, which will be sort of completely self-service. If you dive into this, this is not just a technology problem. This is not just, how do we go design a stack and sort of spin it up. A lot of it is also around the sort of relationships, because, a lot of these tools haven't been built in a way where, we can sort of provision everything from scratch. We have to have a conversation with these vendors. With the sort of Fivetrans and Snowflakes, it's a little bit easier. But as we get into some of, the other vendors which are not quite as big, they have to start to sort of open up some APIs basically for us to be able to go do this, which sort of takes time. So that's kind of one big piece of where we're going now. And I think in the next few months we sort of will finally be at the point where we'll be sort of pretty self-service. And this sort of piece around it is, think of it in some ways like the app store, right? Like, every iPhone today comes with calling, texting, and a sort of web browser. In the same way, if you think about using 5X, everyone will get, ingestion, storage, modeling. And then for all of the other stuff, like, no iPhone comes with a banking app because that's so sort of personal to you. In the same way, a BI tool, depending on the stage of the business, how much money you want to spend, how important, how many users do you have, you might pick between one of 10 different tools out there, all of which, might have their own sort of pros and cons. So we do want to have a store where we can work with sort of any BI tool, or, if they're in reverse ETL, if there's census and high touch, at some point we might start with one, but, hypothetically having both in the store and then letting customers choose what makes sense for them in terms of pricing, in terms of sort of feature set parity, and sort of all of these areas, right? So, we have some opinion on the general architecture of the stack. We've gone with the data warehouse architecture. We don't do Spark or Hadoop out of the box. We're not doing Kafka. We've gone with what we call the modern data stack. So we have, a directional opinion, but we want to be able to give customers the choice of being able to pick what vendors make sense for them, and figuring out how do you stitch it together in a sort of mature way with sort of security and all of these pieces in mind. And apart from making it very, very easy for businesses to go, to sort of get on the data stack movement, we also believe this is great for the vendors because, a lot of these vendors are only focusing on the mid-market to enterprise. Whereas, if a sort of customer today doesn't have a data engineer, it's very difficult for them to go use Snowflake. You require to have technical expertise to kind of use any of these vendors in the space. And I think what sort of 5x with the sort of managed data stack or the data platform as a service can do, this opportunity where, if you have the entire ecosystem set up, even a software engineer could go there and sort of operating it. So, we're reducing the barrier for companies to use the modern data stack. And we think the vendors, the ones who sort of get on board, are going to really benefit from this. It becomes a new channel for them for user acquisition.
And to your point of enabling software engineers to be able to own the data experience and analytics workflow, one of the challenges that often comes up with that is that very specific considerations around data modeling and long-term sustainability of these efforts that at first glance seem you don't need to spend a lot of time with it, but as you scale the utility and scale the number of people who are relying on these systems, it does require much more specialized knowledge about some of the ways that data is its own sort of unique experience. And I'm curious what you see as some of the opportunities for the vendors to be able to help automate or mitigate some of those aspects, and some of the ways that you're working with your customers to help educate them on those requirements.
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. And, in some ways, we actually find it easier if a company has a data team of one or two people and they've started to encounter some of these things themselves. It makes it easier for us to explain that, hey, there is a best practice in how you do it. Just sort of starting with a simple example, a lot of these companies, when they sort of get started, they're building a lot of dashboards on top of their raw data. And, what that results in is a massive fan out problem, right? You change one business metric, you have to go change it in 50 different places. And that's something which when you're sort of starting out you don't think about, but when you've sort of gone into an implementation, you sort of realize how like complicated it is to sort of get out of that, right? Having an actual business layer which is modeled on top of your raw data, right? So that's sort of one example of it. I think in general, this sort of concept of being able to pre-train these engineers on what is the sort of best practice on how to go operate the stack, on how we want to do data modeling. And another sort of use case which we experience very often is this whole concept of single source of truth, right? Where people start to edit data inside the warehouse itself, and all of a sudden numbers don't match sort of universally, right? So often enough, businesses have pretty complicated use cases, and being able to train our engineers on how to spot these things, and what is the best practice, and being able to stick to a sort of single source of truth, and how do you sort of architect around it in a way to yet solve the business use cases of having sort of different systems, be able to sort of reflect accurate sort of data. We solve a lot of this problem by having a pretty comprehensive training program. And what's pretty cool about the training program is, everyone is trained on the core stack, but assuming a company now adds one of our vendors on it, assuming they add decision making with a tool like Narrator, as soon as the company adds that platform onto the stack, the engineer gets an update saying they have a new training module which they need to go sort of ramp up on. So as soon as the new vendor is on the platform, the engineers have been pre-trained on the tool and they understand the best practices on how to go set up that tool. So because we control the platform, we can really provide, core expertise on how do you set and on sort of how do you use this vendor on top of the platform in a way which is going to ultimately serve you in the sort of long term.
Today's episode is sponsored by Prophecy.io, the low-code data engineering platform for the cloud. Prophecy provides an easy-to-use visual interface to design and to deploy data pipelines on Apache Spark and Apache Airflow. Now all the data users can use software engineering best practices, Git, tests, and continuous deployment with a simple-to-use visual designer. How does it work? You visually design the pipelines, and Prophecy generates clean Spark code with tests and stores it in version control. Then you visually schedule these pipelines on Airflow. You can observe your pipelines with built-in metadata search and column-level lineage. Finally, if you have existing workflows in Ab Initio, Informatica, or other ETL formats that you want to move to the cloud, you can import them automatically into Prophecy, making them run productively on Spark. Learn more at dataengineeringpodcast.com/prophecy. As far as the overall ecosystem of data tools and platform components, as somebody who is spending so much time and focus on the modern data stack, I'm curious what you see as the pieces that are going to have some longevity and continue to be core requirements of the ecosystem and of a healthy platform. And what are some of the categories of tools or vendors that you see as being ripe for consolidation, where maybe the data catalog space is going to subsume the lineage providers, or maybe the data warehouses are going to build in their own lineage and catalog capabilities to obviate some of these dedicated platform tools?
Taking a step back and, for a second, switching to like the business, right? Like, what are the use cases businesses really care about, right? And broadly speaking, around three areas. Number one is sort of go-to-market strategy. How do we attract more customers? The sort of second is how are customers using our product, which is mainly around how do we increase engagement, how do we decrease churn? And lastly, how do we optimize our business, sort of decrease costs, right? Sort of automate some of the internal processes so we don't have to kind of put sort of people over there, right? So, you know, thinking about it from this lens, right? These are the three areas which this is why a business is doing data. No one's doing data for the sake of building a data engineering team. They're doing it because it has to kind of go optimize the business and, getting more customers or getting more money, making sure you're sort of keeping your customers and sort of decreasing your costs are ultimately large reasons why sort of people are sort of doing this, right? And kind of now with this lens, kind of flipping this back, I think the areas which have really become more mainstream, especially in the last 1 year, like when you look at sort of something like sort of data lineage of, ensuring that what are your sort of golden data sets in the company, knowing when a job fails, what are the downstream dependencies so that you can be proactive and, sort of prevent the business from sort of using stale data. Or when it comes to something like reverse ETL, where, you're able to ultimately enable some of these teams that are marketing or sales or any of these other areas on, what they're sort of looking for. I think the core stack was really, with sort of ingestion and sort of modeling and sort of storage, it was really around a lot of the infrastructure of, it was a lot more at the infrastructure level. And now, with sort of lineage and sort of reverse ETL and sort of areas like sort of decision making or even sort of data mesh, I think these are a little bit more in line with the business use cases of of what is needed in order to really sort of drive some of the value for the business. So I think these layers are becoming more and more sort of mainstream. And I think AI and sort of data products and like metric stores, we haven't really integrated any of this stuff into our platform. But I think those are some of the sort of areas which I think will sort of very naturally be the next core parts of the stack.
In your work with these organizations and helping them come to grips with the modern data ecosystem, what are some of the either points of confusion or areas that you've had to focus on education to help them understand what are the benefits, what are the risks, what are the trade-offs of using a fully vertically integrated solution, and just understanding when the modern data stack and the work you're doing at 5X is the right choice for them?
I think around two areas, right? I think actually people are understanding more and more that, a vertically integrated stack and having different vendors is the right way to go. And I think a big reason of that is, if you look at the consumer space, we're sort of seeing that, right? Like People want to use Slack for messaging and they want to use Zoom for video. Gone are the days where you're using one platform which sort of does everything end to end, right? So I think people really do resonate with, let's use the best vendor for one use case and integrate a bunch of them. I think what we still see is the sort of, we want to go do data science, you know sort of point of view, where we have companies which have sort of relatively little or like no sort of data experience, and talking about hiring data scientists, and more interested in what are our ML and sort of data science capabilities, instead of really looking at it like sort of pyramids. We're speaking at a podcast and you know doing a lot more blogs and sort of YouTube videos on the education of, hey, this is like a pyramid, and it's like building a skyscraper, and this sort of data science and ML stuff is like the penthouse on top of it. And if you just throw, sort of cemented concrete, you can go 5 stories up, but it's all going to come crashing down. If you're serious about building a skyscraper, you start by digging up the earth instead of going up for some time. So I think, you know, that's really sort of one big piece of, the stuff which we do around education. And I think the sort of second one is largely on, why do we need all of these different tools? Why can't I really hire an analyst today and, go build a sort of dashboard? Like, why can't I do this in steps? Like, why can't I go add DBT into the stack 6 months later? And why are we automating ingestion so early on? And, it's interesting because in the software engineering world, you're pretty used to, building something which works for now and 6 months later re-architecting it. The sort of problem with the data stack is that 6 months down the line, you can't tell the business, hold on, I'll be back in 2 months, I'm going to re-architect the stack. You require business continuity. Data migrations are way more difficult than sort of software engineering database migrations, because it's not just one data source, it's this entire ecosystem and how it all sort of plays together. So it's a little bit tricky to kind of to basically teach companies that you actually want to have the best in class stack on day one, which is going to help you scale, for the next 3 or 4 or 5 levels, instead of incrementally adding pieces.
On the marketplace side of your business, where you're working with engineers to help the customers that you're working with, I'm wondering, what are some of the skills and capabilities and useful background that you are looking for people to be able to help sort of grow your business, scale your customers' analytical capabilities, and some of the ways that you're approaching the onboarding of these engineers to be able to help with growing the analytical capabilities at these companies?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we built a fairly comprehensive process, right? Like most companies, still sort of hire sort of based on sort of syntax based hiring, right? Like, how do you solve this one particular use case, or, what is the answer to sort of this question, right? And one of the first things we developed is a pretty automated process. Like, our core test is, we give engineers access to, 10 different data sources, and they have 6 hours to go ingest this, to go model it, to structure it, clean it, sort of build out reporting, right? So very, very sort of core of what does a data engineer actually do, right? Kind of responsible for 3 core areas: responsible for ingestion, responsible for modeling, responsible for like BI, right? So we sort of test those core abilities at the sort of very get-go. We do like psychometric testing to ensure that we sort of can avoid red flags as much as possible. We're looking for someone with high independence, high communication skills. We're looking for someone who, works well with others, but can also kind of, function pretty autonomously. That's kind of what we're looking for engineers. And, when we train them, there are really two parts to our training process, right? The first one is just on, our core stack, sort of working with Snowflake, working with Fivetran, the sort of best practices. We partner a lot with these companies, have used a lot of their training content on, being able to teach sort of best practices. I think the second piece is, on working with clients, right? Implementing a sort of customer maturity matrix of kind of being like, hey, when you have, a sort of customer who's extremely mature on a tech side, sort of how do we work with them? And over there, we're talking a lot more about being able to, integrate code into Git, and being able to sort of, integrate into their project management tools. And, how does that work compared to a much more earlier stage customer, which for the most part wants us to lead a lot more, sort of start with a very, very sort of generic business requirement. And how do we go from a sort of super generic business requirement to a sort of technical dashboard, right? So, we spend a lot of time kind of teaching our engineers. I wouldn't really call them soft skills, but really, what we have learned with sort of working with customers over the last 7 months, and kind of how do we sort of start to like standardize more and more of this upfront.
As you are working with these engineers who are onboarding, what are some of the challenges that they're dealing with, either in terms of coming to terms with the technologies or figuring out how best to engage with the organizations to help them reach their goals, and just some of the points of friction that exist at each of the different stages between the various players in sort of your experience that you're trying to provide?
I think, anytime you sort of speak about, people, it's a completely different set of problems from sort of platform perspective, right? Like people are not products. People are sort of human beings, and each of them are different. It's much, much harder to sort of generalize, right? So, it's a completely different, sort of having a sort of marketplace on top of a platform, presents its own sort of complete sets of challenges. And, being able to find the right engineer for a sort of customer. We're sort of learning a lot over there on, on the whole matching process, on, what we need to be able to sort of demonstrate in the first few weeks, how these sort of things evolve, how to keep sort of folks accountable. You know, Interestingly enough, if I had to kind of just kind of pick one area, which is sort of common across both, is engineers also asking us, when can we go start doing data science and sort of deploy models and recommendations for these sort of customers. And we have nothing against it. At some point we would love to be more integrated in it, but sort of realizing that for majority of businesses, there's so much more value in just getting much, much, much better at the core stuff than attempting to do any, hacky data science stuff at the moment. So, it's more on how do we commoditize in some ways a lot of the data platform and the data engineering stuff so that companies can ultimately focus more on the data science stuff. And that's really kind of what we're after.
In your work with customers and with the engineers that you're engaging with and just the overall data ecosystem, what are some of the most interesting or innovative or unexpected types of problems that you've been approached with or that you've helped to find solutions for in the work that you're doing at 5X?
So much stuff which, we learn sort of every day, right? Like one of the companies which we're working with is very interested in being able to match leads to sort of sales reps to sort of figure out, hey, instead of just randomly assigning it, is there a way which we can maximize our sort of conversion rates by identifying what sort of sales reps are sort of better at what sort of leads? So, that's a pretty, interesting sort of use case, which sort of actually the teams were sort of looking in sort of pretty recently. We've had other use cases where, by sort of starting to work on a problem, the business actually realizing that, hey, there's a whole new opportunity in the market to basically launch a new product, which makes it, infinitely easier to go search for, information around a particular domain because we were experiencing troubles, being able to effectively model that data sort of from a data modeling perspective. So sort of realizing that, if they could solve this problem, this was a huge opportunity for them to sort of take these products to market. So, can't really, apart from a few of the customers which we've done case studies with, being a little bit more cautious of not getting too deep in terms of, who these customers are and sort of what they're trying to do. But it's been really interesting. Ultimately, we are really focused on adding business value into these customers. Again, going back to what I said earlier, is no one's doing data for the sake of building a data platform or hiring data engineers. They all are doing it to like optimize the business, right? And as an overlying, why we sort of, exist as 5X is ultimately, to make it easier for these companies to really add business value. So it's been really interesting to see how customers are sort of using these capabilities, which we've built to sort of enhance their businesses.
As somebody who has done a decent amount of consulting in the past, one of the things that's always challenging is being able to understand how to quantify the value that you deliver. And given that that is sort of the core focus and the core motivator for what you're doing, I'm wondering how you think about the conversations at the outset about, what it is that you're going to provide to the customer and some of the ways that you measure success in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think they'll keep evolving, but we don't call ourselves a sort of consulting companies. We don't do discovery calls. We don't provide statements of work. We're basically providing you a sort of platform and, a sort of marketplace to embed really high quality engineers into your business, right? So we look ourselves as a long-term solution towards your core data platform and data engineering needs. So, we typically have customers list down top business goals, like what is that use case which could potentially add a zero onto your revenue. We sort of pick one of them and scope that up, not a lot, and have the engineers really focus on a single use case to begin with. So hey, how do we go set up the entire platform and then go focus on this one single use case in the first 4 to 6 weeks, and from there be able to take this to the entire parts of the business. you know, we've been fortunate enough that most companies are just really impressed by how quickly they start to get meaningful data. And a lot of that comes from the fact that we don't set up infrastructure from scratch, and our engineers, are trained on how to, get started out of the box. So, on week one, once we have a deep dive talk and kind of figure out what the first use case is, we're already ingesting data into the platform, right? And by week three, they're already starting to see sort of dashboards and sort of business output. So, we've been fortunate enough that sort of customers are seeing the value in sort of what we deliver, and especially the ones who might have had data teams in the past to know how slowly, how long it took for them to, be able to even, go build their first dashboards compared to how fast it's sort of taken us. So, we haven't really done a lot of inside the consulting world, a lot of work around here's the value we added and this is how much it would have cost. It's been more organic for us so far.
And so, in your experience of starting the 5X business and growing it and starting to bootstrap the marketplace ecosystem and working with your customers, what are some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
It's been really interesting to work with sort of companies across all of these different industries at different sizes, at different sort of revenues. And in some ways, realizing how sort of different they are, how they work and how a lot of these sort of processes are sort of different. In some ways, we're trying to sort of standardize the stack, how we do things. So, there've been some pain points on how do we sort of standardize more and more. But on the flip side, what's been really interesting is kind of going back to what I said earlier in terms of business use cases. It doesn't matter really what industry, what size, how sophisticated a company really is. Ultimately, it's pretty simple to map back what they're trying to do towards three broad areas, right? Which is go to market, how they're using the product, and sort of how do you optimize internal operations. In some ways, it's a lot of customization per industry, per company, but at the same time, all of this customization is around a few core areas and not as broad and wide as a lot of people make it out to be. I mean, obviously you have outliers who, businesses which are focused on, extremely niche use cases, but for the most part, most companies sort of really start with these three core areas. That's a horribly hard question to answer, by the way.
That's why I ask it. And so, for organizations who are struggling with their own internal capacity for building analytical capabilities, what are the cases where 5X might be the wrong choice and they're better suited with just going down the path of hiring internal engineers or working with a fully vertically integrated solution or some other sort of consulting engagement?
I think for the most part, the modern data stack movement encompasses, 80-90% of use cases, but there might be niche use cases, especially, if you are trying to do something which is super real time, using something like Kafka and stream processing might be a lot more relevant for you. Or, using Spark or Hadoop for some of the use cases it's extremely good at, like finding a needle in a haystack, which are, amazing use cases for something like Spark. Then, obviously going down that architecture is probably going to be more valuable for you. I think their, percentages, there's like 10-15% of, pure tech companies which are going to always want to, hire their own teams in-house, and sort of work in their own box. Then obviously, a solution like us won't make sense. But I think, for the vast majority, for like 80% of companies, a solution like us could be really interesting.
As you continue to grow and scale the work that you're doing at 5X, what are some of the things you have planned for the near to medium term?
I think our biggest focus right now is, being able to offer our platform completely self-service. So I think that's going to be the sort of biggest thing. And then, ultimately being able to have more of a sort of ecosystem where we can integrate with, more and more vendors who can sort of come play into our platform, be sort of integrated with this, and we can provide a sort of sales channel for them and ultimately provide kind of more value for like businesses. And I think on the engineering side, we've really sort of focused on India so far. We are in the process of sort of going global. We're about to open South America. So the idea that you'll be able to hire 2 engineers, one, in Mexico, like one in India, and, have around the clock support in terms of sort of core data engineering stuff. So, being able to sort of really have more and more options in terms of the talent needed for your platform, that's kind of coming up there. But I think the biggest focus right now is to launch a self-service version of our platform.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you and follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I'd like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I think the biggest gap is that the space is so fragmented, and this is not, any kind of pitch. This has got nothing to do with 5X. I think, the sort of big, Amazon and Google are not really competitive when it comes to the, sort of holistic data stack. So, there isn't a really good option to, have, an end-to-end offering if you sort of wanted one, right? There are a few companies which, have small bits and pieces of it, but, especially when you look at how like quickly the space is growing and how many new categories have been added, it's honestly been a little bit surprising to think that, isn't something which sort of brings it all together. So I think that was a huge gap.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share the work that you're doing at 5X and your perspective on the modern data ecosystem and some of the ways that it is able to help accelerate time to value for different organizations. So I appreciate all of the time and energy you're putting into that space, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. Thank you so much for having me on the show, and hopefully we were able to add some value to your audience.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.